Do you agree, as modern scholarship agrees, that the Quran author clearly knows the Bible incredibly well? Well then, is it reasonable to think that the Quran author made a mistake and couldn't even get these basic details correct? No, it follows that the Quran author must have been intentionally correcting these corrupted stories. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this video. Today we're going to be looking at a very popular topic that often arises when we discuss the Islamic dilemma with Muslims. That is conscious edits. Now, many of you, whether you're Christian or non-Muslim, when you talk to Muslims and you want to show them the Islamic dilemma, and you point out that their Quran confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and Gospel that is in the Bible today, but in the other hand, it actively contradicts the very doctrines and teachings, the prophetic teachings, the stories of prophets, eschatological views, all these things are contradicted in the Torah and Gospel that supposedly the Quran confirms as being revelation from Allah. Muslims have a way out, and it's called conscious edits. So my aim in this video is that by the time you finish watching this, you guys should have enough of an arsenal to be able to deal with this argument whenever you come across it online or face-to-face with any of your Muslim friends when you present the Islamic dilemma. So first of all, what do Muslims themselves actually mean when they say conscious edits? What Muslims mean is this: because the Torah and the Gospel have undergone some kind of corruption at some point in the past, the stories, the theological views, the prophecies, the prophet accounts, all of these have been changed in major ways that no longer reflect the original that Allah had actually given to Moses and to Isa when he gave the Torah and the Gospel. Because this kind of corruption has occurred and the original has been lost or modified beyond staying true to its original form, they argue that the Quran has taken an interesting perspective here when it addresses the previous scriptures. They would say, yes, the Quran does indeed confirm the previous scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel at least, but whenever the Quran contradicts the content in that Torah and Gospel, the Quran is doing so intentionally. The Quran is actually re-revealing the original story or the original view that was sent to Moses and Isa. So to put it in a timeline, they believe something like this happened. Step 1. Moses and Isa are given revelation. This is true, binding revelation from Allah that completely supports the view found in the Quran. In fact, it is the same content that is found in the Quran. They don't differ. Step 2, at some point in history, those stories, those accounts, the content itself is corrupted textually and no longer agrees with the original sent by Allah to these prophets. Step 3, the Quran is revealed in the 7th century to a guy named Muhammad, and the Quran author, which in their view is Allah, retells the same content that he gave to Moses and Isa again. It is a one-to-one retelling. And because they have this view, they get to say, well, the reason why the Quran contradicts with the very scriptures it supposedly supports and agrees with is because it's doing so intentionally to solve any corrupted parts that have been introduced into those scriptures during this time period, and to return those scriptures in effect back to the originals that Allah revealed to these prophets. Now, on the face of it, this seems like a massive cope. That is because it is indeed a massive cope. But it's important nonetheless to go through this in enough detail to be able to expose why this fails and why it actually introduces other problems. So how should we respond? The first thing we should point out is that this is an entirely circular perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's break this down into what the Muslim is actually trying to advocate for. Point 1, the Muslim is assuming that the Quran author is infallible. The Quran author cannot make errors in this view. Every time the Quran contradicts itself by affirming a doctrine found in another scripture that contradicts its own doctrine, the Quran author is doing so with reason and with intention and is fully self-aware and is not in any way making a mistake or an error. The theory of retelling these stories intentionally leads to a difficulty in falsifying the theory, because if the Quran agrees with something found in the Torah or Gospel, that's intentional and no problem. But if the Quran contradicts with something found in the Torah and Gospel, that's just explained as being intentional correction. In other words, there's no longer any criteria that you can use as a metric to figure out if this theory is false. Since every single verse in the Quran can be explained this way, there's no actual way of knowing, there's no actual way of showing that this isn't correct, since every single outcome has an answer. And of course that answer is an Islamically acceptable answer, and not that the Quran author erred. The second point is that the Quran author has to be all-knowing. The Quran author has to know everything because he has to know the original story, the original content that was given to these prophets, because he has to retell them perfectly, without error. It's not enough for him to tell the gist of the story. He has to tell the story in a correct form that is compatible with the original. He can't change details of prophets' accounts. He can't introduce new aspects of heaven and hell and the afterlife, eschatological issues. He can't introduce these things because then that would accidentally show that he isn't all-knowing and he's just adding things as he sees fit. So what do these 2 points prove? Well, if the author has to be infallible, because they cannot make errors, and that's built into the theory, and if the author is all-knowing, because they have to know the original that was revealed by God to prophets many centuries, if not millennium ago, what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us believing that the author has to be Allah. So in effect, to advocate for conscious edits is to advocate that the author, before we even evaluate anything, is God. It's not only assuming that the Quran is correct, it's assuming that the Quran is infallible, and it's assuming that the author is all-knowing and hence is Allah. It's the same kind of idea as if someone asked me, how do I know the Bible is true? And I responded by saying, all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching. Well, yes, but that's not going to be very useful for convincing anybody who's outside the Christian tradition, because you'd have to be a Christian, first of all, to accept that. Likewise, with conscious edits, you already have to be a Muslim to believe this. And this is why serious scholarship would never take conscious edits as a serious theory to explain what the author of the Quran is trying to do. Another point that's important to realize is that when Muslims use conscious edits, it's worth understanding a little bit of the psychology that's happening here. The Muslim is using this because it's basically, you know when a turtle hides in its shell? It's like that. It's a self-defense technique to try and avoid the harsh consequences of having to deal with something intellectually when you know it can't really be defended. And what they think of when they think of conscious edits is a universal answer to every contradiction. So for example, there are many places in the Quran that contradict with the Torah and Gospel. So conscious edits has to be applied as a band-aid to all of these. It can't just be a band-aid to some, because that wouldn't solve the problem, because there'd still be contradictions left that contradict with the Torah and Gospel. Hence the Islamic dilemma still remains. So conscious edits is a band-aid solution over every contradiction that they perceive of in the Quran with the Torah and Gospel. And hence it's become a very quick, simple answer to basically just to shut down the conversation and to make Muslims feel psychological relief because they don't really need to say much more. It's a band-aid that fits everything, it's sufficiently ambiguous in how it's named as to be confusing, and it kind of assumes that God is the author and the Quran is not only true but infallible anyway. So it puts them in a really good position in that sense. Doubts, the shubha, can just go out the window. But that actually makes it very easy for us, as people who are not Muslims, to tear the band-aid right off and to expose the significant problem that is lying in the wound itself. All you need to do is show that conscious edits does not account for every contradiction. There are many contradictions that are not accounted for, and because of this, the problems still remain. And what's the best way of showing this? Can I give any examples? Yes, I can. The one I find most effective to show this, because there's very little wriggle room for them to get out of this, is the story of Joseph. Now, I mentioned this to Dean Responds when I briefly had a chat with him during a live stream, and he panicked and had no answer to this. I mentioned this to Jake on a live stream, and he panicked and had no answer to this. So it's worth learning this to respond to Muslims when they mention conscious edits. In Surah 12, chapter 12 of the Quran, it is basically the story of Joseph. But it's not the same story of Joseph as we know in Genesis 37, but rather it's a modified form. It has things missing that our account includes, it has extra things that our account doesn't, and it also has one-to-one changes where the content is modified significantly to change the context of the narrative. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the Quran's account when it talks about how Joseph's brothers planned to kidnap him and throw him down a hole. In the Quranic account, they plan this at home, seemingly the day before they actually carry out the kidnapping. But in the Genesis account, they plan to do this as they're walking towards Joseph and they see him in the distance. Now, this is interesting because it's a change in the actual story, in the actual narrative, but it's also something that cannot be explained by scribal error. It's not as if some scribe somewhere down the line made an error in a manuscript and ta-da, the whole scripture was corrupted with this new rendition of the story. It's clearly an intentional change that has occurred. At this point, I very much suggest that you ask your Muslim friend to explain what motive the Jews would have had to corrupt this particular aspect of the story. You can ask them, you can say, okay, you think conscious edits is the Quran correcting prior corrupted scriptures. Okay. This doesn't align with the Quran in this particular instance. In Surah 12, when it talks about how they plotted to kidnap Joseph and throw him down the hole, there are differing accounts. So, in your view, the Muslims' view, you're saying the Jews received revelation in the book of Genesis that was given to Moses about the story of Joseph, but they intentionally corrupted it by changing this very specific part of the story. What are the possible motives that the Jews could have had to have done that? Are there any political motives? Doesn't seem so. Are there any ethical or moral motives? Again, doesn't seem likely. Are there any prophetic reasons? Is this a secret prophecy about Muhammad that the Jews wanted to get away with? Doesn't look like it. Is this an embarrassing part of the story that Jews maybe wanted to hide or get rid of? No, doesn't seem to be. And so we're left without any actual motive for why the corruption would occur. And it's important you push this because Muslims actually have no answer to this. They really don't, and they've never thought about it in much depth either. They don't, including their da'is, they don't have an answer as to why Jews would corrupt their own scriptures in an intentional and significant way that doesn't seem to be something that a rational person would do. When I confronted Jake on this, he simply said that they were hypocrites, and they did it because they're hypocrites. As if that's a motive in and of itself. Well, it isn't. People can be hypocritical all the time. It doesn't mean that they want to destroy their own God-given revelation in such a minor and a completely insignificant way that doesn't seem to benefit them at all. It just means that now they don't have God's revelation. At the next point, it's probably worth pushing them to give an account as to how corruption is actually possible. And again, in the context of the story of Joseph in Genesis 37, the Muslims would have to explain how the Jews collectively, across all of the Jewish diaspora, decided to modify the story in a way that had complete agreement across synagogues, in a way that was then modified without anyone knowing or writing that this had occurred across the entire Jewish diaspora, and in a way that also affected the oral traditions, because again, the Torah is both written and there are rabbis and other Jewish leaders who have memorized this particular story, so you also have to change their collective memory of the story to include this new man-made corruption. It's worth asking Muslims how that's even possible, because again, they just won't have any good answers for you, and they have to kind of look a bit foolish in trying to give possible reasons. Jake, for example, when I spoke to him, said that, well, basically it happened immediately because as soon as the oral tradition began to develop into a written tradition, that process was enough to allow this kind of corruption to creep in. Ignoring the fact that that doesn't account for why they would do this, let's take him at his word. Let's say maybe that is the answer. But then we have another problem because other prophets, according to the Quran, were given the Torah. Most notably, Isa, or Jesus. Jesus is given the Torah, which would have contained the correct version of the Joseph story. So in effect, it's not sufficient for Muslims to argue that the corruption happened once. The corruption needs to happen a multitude of times in order to stay corrupted, basically. And this leads to a pretty devastating end result of this argument, because if they want to throw Jesus under the bus and say something like, well, yes, Jesus did indeed come with the Torah, and yes, it was the corrected one, and it did have the right story of Joseph in it, but you see, he was cast aside, and his Torah didn't really last very long, and they corrupted that, and they got rid of it. Well, Muslims are basically telling you that Jesus was a kind of failed prophet at this point. He wasn't able to preserve either his own revelation, that being the gospel, the Injil, or the re-revealing of the Torah he was given. He couldn't preserve either. Neither could his disciples. So again, it leads to the final view that Jesus is a failed prophet under the Islamic perspective. Muslims won't accept that, but they'll struggle to deal with the point that, again, he brought the re-revealed Torah. So how did that then get corrupted? How did the disciples manage to have that corrupted? Next, we're going to reveal what scholarship has demonstrated about the story of Joseph in the Quran. And there's a reason why this story is so potent. First, this is a story of a prophet, so there's no Christological debate here. We're not asking the Muslims to consider whether Jesus is God or the Trinity. We're not asking them to go into those topics, which they have their own scripts for, but rather we're going to something very basic, namely the stories of prophets that exist both in the Quran and in our scripture in the Torah. But modern scholarship has shown, as Joseph Witztum and Charbel Risk have demonstrated. I'll put links in the description box down below for their articles where you can read their thesis on the Joseph story and its parallels. If I forget to do this, please remind me in the comments, because I am very forgetful. I'm also kind of ill, if you can't already tell by the tone of my voice. I'm having to drink water every few seconds, but anyway. These scholars have demonstrated that the Quran account of Joseph very closely parallels similar accounts we find from particular Syriac authors. One being a Syriac bishop from the Church of the East known as Joseph of Saru. He was well known for his homilies that he would write and perform as part of the liturgy. One of the homilies he wrote was on the Joseph story. Another person who seems to have influenced the Quran story in chapter 12 of Joseph is Pseudo-Nasai, whose retelling of the Joseph story also seems to have made its way into the Quranic account. Now, in my book, which you should all totally buy, it's coming out March, April time, and goes into this in a lot more detail. I cover these parallels that these scholars demonstrate in more detail, including the example I gave earlier. That example and others mentioned in the articles show how the Quran is more in line with their retellings of the story, which differ from the Genesis 37 account, and are therefore not retellings of the original. And that's important because remember, with the idea of conscious editing, the Quran, when it tells a story, like the Joseph story, that is meant to be found in Genesis, it must be correcting to the original account that was given to Moses. It cannot be a human account that was just contemporary with the Syriac church at the time of Muhammad. Because if it is, then the author of the Quran is not actually re-revealing the original, but is actually engaging with contemporary Christians over the story of Joseph. You can't do both at once. You can't claim to be re-revealing the original story given to Moses, but then obviously just be copying from a man-made work in the 5th and 6th century. I mean, it's a case of plagiarism, right? Like if you see someone copying a test or someone else's test, then you know that they haven't stolen the answer sheet, so to speak, and just copied the answers word for word, but rather they've taken another student's test and they've just copied their answers. Hence, it cannot be a re-revealing. This is made even more profound by the fact that the story in chapter 12, ayah 3, actually says that this was given to Muhammad and he did not know about this story before. So even within this very specific story in the Quran, it actually says this is from Allah. Muhammad, you didn't even know about this story, but Allah beamed it to you, and now you know the real story of Joseph, which suspiciously is very much influenced by random Syriac authors. But okay. It's worth pointing out that in, again, the same chapter, in verse 111, it says that there are lessons of understanding in these stories that the people of the scripture possess. That not only are these stories valid, but they are confirming those that are found in the prior scriptures, even though they don't. And they differ significantly and intentionally. This is just a single example of how you can very quickly neutralize conscious edits, show there are examples where that doesn't work at all, and therefore contradictions still remain. Muslims need to give other things to explain away the contradictions. Now, Muslims, the way they argue conscious edits is kind of rhetorical to the extreme, because they know they're on shaky grounds, so they won't give a logical response. They'll give a rhetorical response in which they'll say things like this. Do you agree, as modern scholarship agrees, that the Quran author clearly knows the Bible incredibly well? And you go, well, yeah, it seems as if he does. And then they say, well then, is it reasonable to think that the Quran author made a mistake and couldn't even get these basic details correct? No, it follows that the Quran author must have been intentionally correcting these corrupted stories. And they'll make a big deal out of this. You gotta shut this down quick, and it's very easy to do. The answer lies in the first part, so when they say that the Quran author knows the Bible very well, stop them right there and say, no. He doesn't know the written canon, the written scripture, well at all. In fact, scholars like Sidney Griffith and others have made the argument, like in his book The Bible in Arabic, that there almost certainly wasn't a Bible translated into Arabic at the time of Muhammad. What does that mean? It means the Quran author wouldn't have had access to our scriptures in Arabic to even check if they are aligning. It also means that the Quran author may not have actually known what the Bible was exactly. He knows what some of it is, but not all of it, which of course raises the question of whether or not he is all-knowing. Seems as if the best explanation is that he probably isn't, and therefore he's not God. That's another little side dilemma for anyone who wants to investigate that. But the main point is that we illustrate that yes, the Quran author knows a lot about the stories found in the Bible, but he does so because of oral traditions. And again, this is what Sidney Griffith and others point out. It's through oral narrations and oral retellings of these stories that people in the Hijaz would have heard about them. They aren't reading the Bible in Arabic. So when Muslims try and pull that on you, you simply need to make that distinction. No, he does not know the Bible well at all because he doesn't seem to know the canon. He thinks that the infancy gospel of Thomas is there. He thinks that the pseudo-evangelial gospel of James is there. But he clearly knows the oral traditions very well. And this, of course, allows us to speculate on what's happening here. And I think the best explanation that anyone can see, including Muslims, if they be honest and they really think about this and they don't go into defensive rhetoric mode, is that the Quran author knew a lot of these stories and he managed to get the overall gist in a lot of instances correct on these stories. That's why they line up so well. That's why he knows Moses and his brother Aaron, and he knows about the Pharaoh, and he knows about the parting of the sea, and he knows about the plagues, right? But the details he kind of doesn't get right all the time. Not because he's consciously editing things, but either because he's not aware of the details, or, and this is something Muslims don't want to acknowledge either, and you can be open to this, you can say, or the Quran author isn't intentionally retelling the story at all. The Quran author is just engaging with variants of the story available in the Hijaz, contemporary in his lifetime, that were being told by Christians and Jews, and he was engaging with them in order to combat their understanding of the story and to help him in practical elements to start and set up his own religion known as Islam. And both of these explanations, and I'm inclined to think it's a bit of both of these explanations are very human. They are not divine. They're the most human thing you could imagine. So again, the best explanation for these facts is that the Quran author is human, not divine, not God. Hence Islam is false. Another kind of thing they do with rhetoric is they go very heavy into this idea that the Quran author intentionally does something. This must be intentional. And it's kind of just a sideline question that's meant to throw you off by being so out of the blue. It's not really a serious question as such because it doesn't have any bearing on the point at hand. Whether the Quran author is intentionally not in line with the scriptures or intentionally deviating from those scriptures works either way from our perspective. Like, for example, with the case of Joseph, the Quran author could actually be aware that the influences he's engaging with Joseph of Saru, Pseudo-Nasai, and Afrahat and others, he's engaging with them intentionally over what he knows to be the correct story that's found in the Torah at his time. That's perfectly possible. But again, it still means he's not retelling the story. In other words, it still means conscious edits are false, and it still means he's choosing to engage with human works, not with something that could have potentially been revealed to Moses. Rob Sentinel, I shouldn't call him Rob Sentinel, Rob from Sentinel Apologetics, a good friend of mine, when he did his insanely deep Quran study, where he went through 3 commentaries, I think, on the Quran, he pointed out to me, he said, Chris, what I've noticed is the Quran almost always interacts with common error sources. It never interacts with sources before the Common Era. And what he means by that is that when we can see what has influenced the Quran's content and the Quran's narratives found in its scripture, we see that it's being influenced by sources that are usually contemporary to the time of Muhammad, or available and around at the time of Muhammad, or very popular at the time of Muhammad in that area, in Arabia. The Quran doesn't engage with sources from before the Common Era period. For example, Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or other works that predate the turn of the Common Era. Why this is significant is because, again, it kind of ties up with the whole Muslim perspective of conscious editing, or really re-revealing the original story, because what they're saying is that the Quran actually should be engaging with these before Common Era sources, particularly when it comes to the Torah. Now, this isn't to say that what we have now is de facto the revelation given to Moses. I'm not assuming that. But what I'm assuming is that the Quran must be engaging with potential candidates that could be the actual revelation given to Moses. But instead, the Quran author doesn't do this. The Quran author instead engages with very popular reinterpretations or commentaries or homilies at his time in Arabia. What's the best way of explaining that? I think it's that the Quran author is human and doesn't have access to these potential candidates for the revelation given to Moses, so he has to make do with the sources that he has at his time. I hope you guys find this useful for the next time you engage someone who's trying to argue for conscious edits. But to summarize, remember that it's a completely circular argument. It assumes that the author is infallible and all-knowing, therefore the author is God. While no serious scholarship takes this idea seriously, the term conscious editing is misleading. What they really mean is retelling the original revelation given to Moses and Isa in the Quran. We can demonstrate that's not always the case because there are stories in the prophetic accounts that don't line up and have obviously shown influence by other sources. There are many of these, by the way. You can read more about it in my book. And how we should respond to some of the rhetorical claims of intentionality and the awareness of the oral traditions in the Bible. And we also mentioned that there are plenty of examples of contradictions that don't involve high Christology, the deity of Christ, etc., etc. We can go with much less controversial examples of differences and contradictions that Muslims have to answer. And we've also expressed that if there are still contradictions remaining, then that means conscious edits doesn't work. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this video useful. God bless you all, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.